stories. 2 summers ago, I served on the grand jury, and you're on for 3 weeks. Grand jury in New York State, if you don't know, is the place that you decide on felony cases whether or not they should proceed into a trial case. So you see a lot of things that are pretty intense. And as the grand jury, you listen to evidence and then give just a yay or nay to the district attorney to proceed with the case. So I served for 3 weeks. There were 22 of us. We heard 74 cases. There were hard topics to listen to. Things like drunk driving, homicide, children testifying about sexual assault, to rape. And one case just kind of jolted me sideways. There was this young woman sitting in front of us who was about 19. She had come to Rochester to go to college from a small town outside of Rochester. And she was telling about something that happened to her 2 days beforehand. And what she starts telling the story that she had gone out with her girlfriends. And they had one who was, you know, the designated driver, and they were at a party at a bar, and they had all been drinking, and then all of them went to a house party. But after she was there for a while, she realized all of her girlfriends were hooking up with their boyfriends at the house party. So now it's about almost 12 o'clock. She doesn't know Rochester at all. And she says to her friends, you know what, I'm gonna go home. And one of her girlfriends says to her, well, you gonna be okay? And she's like, yeah, I got it, don't worry. So she starts walking, and she's tired and disoriented and a little drunk, but mostly doesn't know where the heck she is, right? So she's walking along, and she pulls her cell phone out, and she pulls her phone out to call her parents, who live, you know, half an hour away, like, where the heck am I? I don't know where I am, really. But while she's talking to them, her cell phone dies. Then she realizes she has no money in her purse that she hasn't won. So she's walking along, this guy drives up next to her, yells out the window, hey, do you wanna ride? She's like, okay. So she gets in. The guy says to her, where do you want to go? And she says, I want to go back to campus. And he goes, okay, no problem. He starts driving, and she's so tired, she kind of rests her head against the door. And she realizes soon enough that the guy is not bringing her back to campus. What he's doing is bringing her back to his apartment. Pulls a knife on her, drags her upstairs, and for the proceeding of the rest of the evening, rapes her throughout the night. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she asks whether or not she can leave. And the guy says to her, yes, as long as you don't tell anybody what you've been doing. She says, I promise. She walks downstairs, she walks to the end of the block. There is a barber shop there on the corner. She walks in. She calls her parents immediately, who now are already in Rochester, talking to all of her friends because they're frantic that they couldn't find her. She calls the police. The police come, of course. They have her retrace her steps about where she has been. They get a search warrant, they go up into the apartment, and they find all the evidence that they need in order to bring a case against this guy. So we voted in favor of all of that. At the end of that, after the break of hearing that whole thing, I remember distinctly what happened to us as a group. You are discouraged, actually, from talking about such cases, but the room was abuzz with things like, that poor girl, if only she were more street smart, if only she wasn't drunk, if only her phone hadn't died, if only, if only. I remember thinking, geez, that's not the issue. That's almost blaming her for her trauma, for violence against her. But above all, I had an even stronger feeling going on in me. I left that day mad that the sisterhood had let her down. I kept running through my head, actually. How did her friends not look out for her? How did the girl she had known to love and bond with leave a friend in such a terrible predicament? I was mad at the sisterhood. Which leads me to another story. grew up in a college town in Wisconsin, which the drinking age, I swear, is 5 sometimes, but at the time it was 18. And when you grow up in a college town like that and you're in high school, you go to a lot of college parties, whether you told your parents that or not, but you know, it's kind of assumed. Anyway, so we're out one night at a college party, at a house party, and our friend Lynn was driving, and we were all there, and then it kind of got late, and she's gathering everybody up, and Lynn says to me, you know, where's Kaaren? And I'm like, I don't know where Kaaren is. Then we see this guy who Carrie had kind of been flirting with and hanging out with, pulling Carrie up the stairs, kind of half pulling her, half encouraging her, and she was pretty drunk. Lynn says to me, come with me. She walks over to the guy, she takes his hand, and she says, buddy, you're not going to be lucky tonight. See ya. And we walk down the stairs, and Carrie, like, affably, hey, OD, bye, you know? And something occurred to me about that whole thing. I have always thought of that as what the sisterhood meant. Looking out for each other, being part of what I've always thought was the role for women. To protect and secure each other's potential ill-fated decisions and intervene when needed. We looked out for each other and we bonded by keeping each other safe. That's what I mean by the sisterhood. Now for the last few years, I have held on to that view. I thought I was right. Then diving into this topic with a certain sense of inquiry, I realized something. We live in a culture that blames the victim for assault, from domestic violence to rape, by saying things like, she shouldn't have drank so much, or she was flirting, or she shouldn't have worn that outfit, or been in that neighborhood, or why doesn't she just leave someone who's beating her? How hard is that? We blame whatever happens to women on women. And after reading through all this material, I realized, Kaaren, wake up, girl. You are doing the same thing. And I was. By relying on the sisterhood alone, on women to look out for women, I, in effect, am giving an if only response. If only the sisterhood had been there for that girl on that bleak night. And it occurred to me, I'm viewing our collective ethos of normalizing violence against women from inside the fish tank. I am a fish in that water, as are all of you. But what is really needed to understand the water we swim in is to get out of that tank. Like a cat who sits outside and watches what happens to the fish inside the tank. A cat who holds a different perspective to the tank in general. Because if I am a cat looking in, there is a lot happening that would be described as a war on women that my feline self wouldn't have missed in the last year. In the media, covers like this, I'm sorry I don't have a bigger image of this. This was on Vogue this last year. End up donning our newsstands. The cover makes it look like choking women is in vogue now. As one blogger comments, but this imagery shouldn't be used to sell magazines because violence should never be fashionable. She's right. But how come we've almost become immune to that imagery? Well, because we walk by images like this, headless mannequins. Yes? Have you all seen these? But what does that image convey? I want you to think about that. Well, a woman with no head means that they have no imagination or thinking connected with one's body. It allows the idea of women as just a body, not as a human, to be reinforced over and over and over again. In the last year, you may recall that Rush Limbaugh, the radio personality, called Sandra Fluke a slut for advocating for women's rights to insurance that covers birth control. Do you know how many people listen to Rush Limbaugh? 20 million people a day. In politics, we've had an election year where congressional candidates speak of legitimate rapes or view pregnancies resulting from such acts of violence, of sexual violence, as God's will. This last year, The Republican VP nomination himself spoke in such terms. This year, after 18 years, the House Republicans let the Violence Against Women Act expire. You know why? Because they opposed the expanded version to the legislation which increased protection for the LGBT community, immigrants, and Native American women, many of which are the most vulnerable in our culture and need the most support. We live in a country where 1 in 5 women are raped in their lifetime, and 1 in 7 women are stalked. The Center for Disease Control says violence against women is the #1 health threat for women in this country and abroad. Did you hear me? The #1 health threat. And we live in this country. Perhaps the sharpest dichotomy to violence this year is with Penn State and Notre Dame. Penn State, of course, was all over the news because the assistant football coach, Jerry Sandusky, raped young boys, which was followed by a national outcry, which it deserved. It got a ton of media attention. But alongside Penn State is the brutal raping of 2 Notre Dame students by 2 football players. Post-rape, one of the girls, Lizzie Seberg, wrote out a statement and submitted to medical attention. Soon after doing so, she received texts on her phone immediately from folks on the football team saying things like, "Don't do anything you'll regret," or "You don't want to mess with Notre Dame football." So Lizzie Seberg didn't push it. She went to the next Notre Dame game and cheered on her assailants. And then on September 7th, she wrote her therapist that she felt like she was in a hole and wanted to take whatever pills she could find, yet promised her therapist that she would not follow through on it. But then on September 9th, she had a panic attack during a mandatory freshman orientation on sexual assault. She committed suicide later that day. The other accuser, despite of a description of a similar brutal rape, won't file any charges. Absolutely 100% won't, because of what happened to Seberg in her experience. Notre Dame administration had little to say about the rape, even though they market heavily the moral leadership of the Catholic institution, whose mission statement is a university dedicated to the pursuit and sharing of truth for its own sake. The head coach, Brian Kelly, to his shame, treated questions about Lizzie's suicide as a joke. And both players who were alleged of the crime played a very publicized bowl game, if you'll remember, in January between Notre Dame and Alabama, with hardly any mention in the media about the incident. So why didn't this incident get any national attention? Why the difference? One commentator, seems to me, from The Nation magazine said it best. The only answer that makes sense is that it's been internalized in our culture that while boys are helpless in the face of a predator, women are responsible for their assault. The accuser are the accused. While writing this sermon, I came across the words of Andrea Dworkin. Any of you remember Andrea Dworkin from the 80s? She was a radical feminist. Love that girl. She wrote this. Have you ever wondered why we women are not just in armed combat against you men? It's not because there's a shortage of kitchen knives in this country. It's because we believe in your humanity against all the evidence. I shared this quote with a friend of mine, and I said, it seems to me it's more than that. It's because we love men. Men are our husbands. Men are our sons. They're our brothers. They're our grandfathers. We love them and believe in them. And she said to me, yeah, and we gave birth to all of them. We were once part of each other. We were tied together. Then she said, it seems to me women haven't lost that, but men have. Then she said, what happened? I spent some time thinking about that question, what happened? I'm not sure I can answer that, and maybe that as women we've never held or been allowed to hold the same kind of emboldened humanity as men throughout history. Or it may be as simple as this: we have never had a movement or a call that included all of us. Not just women against violence against women and oppression, but all of us. We've never taken it on as a pervasive cultural issue. We haven't moved from a women's issue to a human issue, ever. Reminds me of how the GLBT community was making progress with their issues, yet were often marginalized with their concerns. If you will remember, it wasn't until straight people who loved and knew and cared for and saw their own humanity in their GLBT brothers and sisters and said, "What you do to my GLBT brothers and sisters, you do to me." When people saw each other as part of the same human family, the GLBT community could then take larger steps forward. So in my answer to my friend's question, what happened, I think I'd respond, I don't know what happened, but I sure as hell know what has to happen. And it is not the sisterhood. I was way off in that. Instead, it requires an ongoing vigilance to remember we are tied together, men and women, in our joint humanity. We are one. And once we start doing that, we just might have a shot at being more honest, really, about what needs to change, what needs to be nipped in the bud, and what world we are trying, really, to create. I think a good start would be for men to rethink what it means to be masculine. Perhaps the most vocal person in the country on this topic is a guy named Tony Porter, who started an advocacy and awareness group called A Call to Men. Tony explains that from a very young age, he was taught what it means to be a boy, a man. You had to be tough and strong and courageous, show no pain or emotion, and especially, anger was okay, but especially not fear. As a man, you demonstrate power control over women. You played an aggression, dominance, protector role with women. You were not supposed to be like a woman. You were supposed to make decisions and not need help. You were heterosexual. Men were superior, women inferior. Women were of less value, and women were objects, especially sexual objects. Over time, Tony explains that he has come to believe that that way of thinking about manhood, or the collective socialization of men, or what each man carries around with him as his own man box. That's what he calls it. Your own man box. Tony will tell you there's a lot that is great about being a male, but as he says, there is also a lot that is twisted, and how important it is to challenge the ingrained assumptions. To have men involved in the process of deconstructing, redefining what we have come to know as manhood is essential. Tony has 2 children. He gives some great examples of what this is about, but I want to share 2 of them with you. He has 2 children that are about the same age. They are a year apart. And he says he found himself treating them differently at a very early age. When his daughter was hurt or distraught, he'd always take her, sit her on his lap and comfort her and talk her through what was going on. But he said when his son was very little, in fact, and would start crying, he said he'd let the crying go for about 30 seconds, which was usually about the time some little kid gets hurt and then they make their way to you, right? He said by the time his son got to him, he'd say things like this to him. "Why are you crying? Hold your head up. Look at me. Explain to me what's wrong. I cannot understand you when you are crying." And out of his own frustration of his role and responsibility of building his son up as a man to fit into these guidelines and these structures that are defining his man box, he would find himself saying things like this. You know what, just go to your room. Just go in your room. Sit down, get yourself together, and when you can come out and talk to me like a man, you do that. His son was 5. He tells many stories of how his man box gets in the way, as it does for many men. But this one event, and I gotta tell you, this is a little hard to hear, but this one event as a preteen served as a large awakening to him. When he was 12, he lived on a tenement right in northern Manhattan. And on the street, there was a kid named Johnny, who all the younger kids kind of looked up to. And one day, Tony says, he's out in front of his tenement, he's kind of joking around, and Johnny yells out the window, "Hey, Anthony, come up here." So he goes upstairs. He says, because when Johnny called you, you go. Johnny opens the door to his bedroom and says, "Do you want some?" Now, Tony said he immediately knew what he meant. Because for him, in his relationship with his man box, "do you want some?" meant one or of two things. Either sex or drugs. And they weren't doing drugs. Now, he says his box, his card, his man box card, was immediately in jeopardy. For one, Tony had never had sex, and for two, he couldn't tell that to Johnny. Because according to the man box rules, you are always on the prowl. Women are objects, especially sexual objects. So Tony simply says to Johnny, "Yes." And he goes into the room, and on the bed there is a neighborhood girl naked named Sheila. Sheila was 16 years old and was mentally ill. Now, Johnny had just got done having sex with her. Actually, he had raped her. But because Sheila never said no, she never said yes either. Johnny was offering Tony the opportunity to do the same thing. So he walks into the room and he closes the door, and he's petrified. He's 12. He stands with his back to the door so Johnny wouldn't bust in and see that Tony wasn't really doing anything. And he's trying to figure out how to get out of the room right now. So in his 12-year-old wisdom, he zips his pants down and he walks into the living room, where unbeknownst to Tony, Johnny had now gathered all the boys in the neighborhood for the same opportunity. And the group of boys ask him, "So, how was it?" He pulls up his zipper and he goes, "It was good," and he leaves. Now, Tony relays that story with deep remorse, but he says at the time he was conflicted because while feeling regret and shame, he was also excited he didn't get caught. Tony says this fear of getting outside the man box had completely enveloped him. And at 12, it was more important to him to maintain his man box card than it was to be concerned with Sheila. Tony concludes telling his story with these words. "Collectively as men, we are taught to place less value on women, to view them as property and the objects of men. We see that as an equation that equals violence against women. But we as men, good men, the large majority of men, we all operate on the foundation of this whole collective socialization. See, we need to understand that when we treat women as lesser value, as property or objects, that serves as the foundation for our understanding. But without that, the violence can't happen." He continues, "When I think of my daughter, I think of how I want men behaving with her. What world do I envision for her? But I need men on board. I need you working with me and me working with you on how to raise our sons and teach them to be men. They need to be told it is okay not to be dominating, that it's okay to have feelings and emotions, that it's okay to promote equality, that it's okay to have a best friend who is a woman. Because in the end," he says, "I have come to believe my liberation as a man is tied to your liberation as a woman." And I love that line. "I've come to see my liberation as a man tied to your liberation as a woman." His take on this reminded me that the man boxes hold true for women as well, and I am embarrassed to say this. But there have been times that my own husband has said to me, "Why don't you see I'm hurt? I'm telling you I'm not angry at you. I'm telling you I am hurt. Why can't you see me that way?" And when that has happened to me, I've realized this socialization of men not only affects how men are kept in the box, but how women have been socialized to keep them in the box as well. And in the end, it's to our own detriment, isn't it? So yes, it takes work from all of us. It takes things like consent education for teens, which is brand new for us with Our Whole Lives, Our Sexual Education for Unitarian Universalists, which is now included in 9th grade education. It takes things like the march, the 1 Billion Rising movement that took place across the world on Valentine's Day. It takes men and women writing their congressmen about needing to support the Violence Against Women's Act, which we signed letters at First Unitarian to encourage, in particular, Tom Reed, who had originally voted against it. And then Louise Slaughter brought it up again, and they voted for it. And lo and behold, it really did, it like passed on Monday. We were all so excited that it was going around. So we do have thank you notes. I think it means a lot to send your representatives who were conflicted about doing this, because the entire GOP kind of was all on this side about this. To send them thank you notes that it matters, that they continue to hold and honor the Violence Against Women. It takes people to not remain silent as bystanders to domestic violence and sexual assault. In short, it seems to me it requires all of us to evolve. Evolve. From fish in the tank to another creature who has legs and fur and hair and keen eyesight. Evolve so we are less like a fish and more like the cat on the outside of the tank. Tony asked a 9-year-old boy once, "What would life be like for you if you didn't have to adhere to this man box?" And he said to him, "I would be free." May that, friends, be what we together in our liberation of each other's fullest selves, may we someday all be free.
Creation. Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.